million. And I work very closely with them in their initiative to reframe and restructure their system, which has all been around the science of reading and building multi-tiered systems of support, selecting tools, resources, professional development to support that learning. And we will be talking with them in our literacy network in the future. So I encourage all of you who might be interested in the collaborative conversations that we have in terms of learning what we've learned from them, the good, the bad, and where we are now. So I encourage you to consider joining us in that as well. And to think about this from the perspective of the objective is not to identify whom to blame for issues, problems. It's to find out where the system failed. So when we look at our structures and we look at our systems, we really want to think about those systems and what pieces of them are strong and what pieces might be failing us, because we never succeed in directing or telling people how they must change. We don't succeed by handing them a plan or pestering them with our interpretations, or even relentlessly pressing forward with our agenda, believing that volume and intensity will convince them to see it our way. So what do? We can never direct a living system. We can only disturb it. And so we're going to talk about this science of reading today and how we might find it as a means of being an entry point to disturb current systems. So by introducing information that contradicts old assumptions, by demonstrating that things people believe that they can't do are already being accomplished someplace else, as in our model district over in Dover, and other school districts in our region, by inviting new people into the conversation, as you have joined us today, and by rearranging those structures so that people relate in ways they're not used to, by presenting issues from different perspectives. And so that is what we hope to do for you today, is to challenge your belief systems, to think about your systems, to think about what entry points you can use from us and with us to disturb whatever it is that you might want to look at in terms of change on this frontier of school reform. Knowing that we're always going to have trailblazers, we're always going to have pioneers, settlers, and unfortunately we do have some saboteurs with us along the way, and as well as some stay-at-homes that are identified in the article on the frontier of school reform. So I'm choosing to believe that because you're with us today, you're one of those trailblazers and pioneers that are joining us here locally as we continue to move forward, trailblazing our efforts at a state level. So welcome, and I am going to let Erin take over now, silence my voice, because I think I've given you a lot to think about. So I will continue joining in the conversation, and with that, I am going to let Erin take over at this point.
Thank you, Diane. I'm Erin Adkins, and I am the Urban Literacy Specialist here at SST 12. And excuse me, this is my second year with the SST, and I previously worked as an intervention specialist and a kindergarten teacher. So, as many of you have already done, placing your name, your role, and your organization in the chat. I thank you for that. If you have not done so, please go ahead and do that now. Today, we are going to be engaging on the Padlet, and you should have received a link for that in the email to participate with us today, as well as the participant folder, which contains the slides for today, along with an area for note taking. And you can also link out to all of the videos as well as the Padlet from there. I can go ahead and make sure that is in the chat for you now, just in case you don't have it. Okay. Here is the Google Drive folder. And then the Google Drive folder does contain a link to the Padlet, but I am going to go ahead and put that in the chat for you now as well. So there are both of those links. And welcome again to everybody. All right, just real quickly, some webinar norms. I encourage you to be an active participant. We will have some polls to engage in, as well as breakout rooms, and also using the chat box. If you have a question, feel free to unmute and jump in, or to type it into the chat box. We will try to keep a close eye on that, as well as any comments you may have. Close up any other apps on your device you may have. Open your webcam if possible. I know that's not always possible, and just have fun with us while learning. I really invite you to engage with us today, and we're all here to embrace our collective wisdom and support one another in our continuous learning around the science of reading. Okay, so our objectives for today include defining the science of reading, of course. We are going to explore a little bit about how the brain learns to read, as well as identifying a next step to use or learn more about the science of reading and helping to plan for explicit reading instruction. We're going to start off with a welcome poll. I will go ahead and launch that. And it's really, why are you here today? You are here and science of reading is brand new to you, or you are here because you are somewhat familiar with the science of reading, or you're very familiar with the science of reading. I'll give you a few more moments. We're about 80% of participants have engaged. Good, I'll give it about 10 more seconds. We have about 2 more people that haven't participated, so I'll just kind of wait and see and make sure that everyone's had a chance. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share the results. So most of you, 51%, the science of reading is brand new and you're here to better understand it, which is wonderful. About 38% of you are somewhat familiar with the science of reading and you're here to deepen that understanding. And then 11% very familiar with the science of reading and here to validate your practice. Perfect. So I just want to invite you all to be open to learning and set aside any deep-rooted beliefs you may have regarding reading instruction. I want you to embrace any new knowledge that research has proven to support struggling readers. And to tell you my own story, I did mention that I was a kindergarten teacher and an intervention specialist. And before I was introduced to the science of reading, I was in the classroom for a few years, and I had learned in college that best practice was balanced literacy. I also wholly supported whole language learning. I was a child of the 80s. I learned to read easily. I learned to read almost just automatically, being in a literate environment. My own children went through school learning with that balanced approach, and they learned to read very easily. So I had just fallen in love with this balanced whole language approach and using the literate environment as the second teacher. But when my feet hit the pavement in that classroom, I soon found out that a large number of my students were just not making progress. And through a grant that my district was awarded, I learned research-based, explicit ways to teach reading, and that helped reach my struggling readers, but also benefited all students. It also was a benefit to those students who are already learning to read. I moved positions into an intervention specialist and continued to utilize those research-based approaches, and I watched my struggling readers grow and learn to read like they hadn't before. Okay. So one more quick poll just to test your knowledge. It has 2 questions. And the first question is, let me get this launched for you. Our brains are ready to learn to read, much the same as we are born ready to learn to speak. True or false? And the second question, how does the brain process text when reading? Letter by letter or as whole words? We're at about 89%. I'll give a few more moments for a few people to add in their answers. If you don't know, just take your best guess. It's totally anonymous. Okay, going once, going twice. Going to end the poll and share the results. Okay, so we have a little bit more saying false, but pretty close those saying true, that we learn to read as much as we learn to speak, born ready. So we're going to discuss that first question. And if you said false, you were correct. And I am going to tell you why and the research behind it. So no one is born to read. It's not natural, like walking or talking. And reading doesn't happen by osmosis from being read to or being in that literacy-rich environment. There are a very small number of children who seem to learn that way. But if a student seems to be struggling, we can't just wait and see. And there is no such thing as giving students the gift of time. If we wait, some kids just don't get it. And if they aren't getting it by the end of first grade, those students tend to not catch up with their peers, even with interventions. So we need to directly teach reading skills rather than taking the child's lead to be more effective. And there are not multiple ways to learn to read. All skilled readers have phonics skills and appropriate language skills. So the answer to the second question, how does the brain process text when reading? If you answered letter by letter, you were correct. Even though it may seem like we are reading whole words, it is letter by letter. I'm going to move to the next slide and show you the research behind it. So, contrary to claims of a popular viral email, I don't know if you came across this on social media, but it's a paragraph that went around of scrambled words. And it had the first letter and the last letter of each word in that paragraph correct, but everything in between was scrambled up. And we are, as proficient readers, we are able to process what that says. And it said, so therefore we read words by whole word. And that is simply not true. Our brains are just good at recognizing patterns. And multiple experimental studies have shown that skilled readers perceive every letter in words they read, unless they're skimming. So we can instantly and flawlessly recognize words like black, block, blink, bland, brick, brink, and blank. And when they are presented in isolation for 1/20th a second. So unless we perceive each of the letters, there's no explanation for how we could accomplish this. We are going to watch a quick 5-minute video. This is Dr. Keith Rayner, and he is a professor with the psychology department at the University of Massachusetts. He is also the director of the university's eye tracking laboratory. And it's all about how we focus on whole words and we don't focus on the whole words, but how quickly we perceive and read each letter in the words.
I'm mainly interested in finding out what's going on inside the head as people are reading and understanding text. I think what eye movements are doing is reflecting the moment-to-moment processing that people are engaging in. In silent reading, you typically move your eyes about every 250 milliseconds. Okay, that's about the average fixation time of the eye. But there's a lot of variability around that. Sometimes it's as short as 100 milliseconds. Sometimes it can be as long as 500 milliseconds. And the variability is being largely driven by things related to how easy or difficult it is to process the word that you're looking at. So a word that's hard to look at, a very low frequency, unfamiliar word, the eyes will systematically remain on that word longer, will also more likely make a second fixation on the word before moving on. Whereas a very high frequency familiar word, you may only need one relatively shorter fixation. Like I said, the average is around 250, but there's lots of variability. It's being, how long the eyes are there is being driven by the difficulty of encoding the information. In oral reading, the eyes tend to fixate a bit longer, but there are places where the eye sort of pauses to not get too far ahead of the voice, right? In silent reading, the average fixation duration is around 250 milliseconds. There's time that's involved in moving the eyes from one place to another, so that the latency, just the simple motor reaction time of the eye, is about 150 milliseconds at least. So there's not a lot of time in there to process the information that you're looking at, yet it's still interesting that, as I said, the eyes are being influenced by how hard or easy the word is to process.
We're talking about processing this code at a pretty good clip, faster than we can think about, unconscious, all automatic, and on average, so many milliseconds per letter into sound, or the thing doesn't work.
That's right. It's all happening very fast at an unconscious level. I suspect that most letters that are in your sort of foveal zone, or the area right around your fixation, are probably being processed pretty much in parallel. So I don't think we need to think of them as, one 25 milliseconds, another 25 milliseconds, but averaged over them, it's going to be about 25 milliseconds. Yeah. Very fast, staggeringly fast.
Okay. Let's get back to our presentation.
Can I just interject something here for a minute?
Mm-hmm.
So as you listen to that, I just want to encourage those of you who may have answered on as whole words to not be confused with what we've learned. For instance, when we're looking at phonological awareness as the umbrella, and moving down to phonemic awareness, which enables us to move to that orthographic mapping part of the brain. To remember that we do go whole to part when we're thinking about progression of phonological awareness skills on a continuum. So we would start with those larger pieces of rhyming and alliteration and segmenting and blending and those whole pieces, and move to the individual level in terms of instructional strategies. So for that not to be confused with, we want to always go whole to part and large to small, simple to complex when we're looking at a continuum of instructional strategies and understanding phonological awareness within that continuum. But when the brain then actually begins to read, and we move from speaking and hearing the sounds of language to reading and writing them, that we're moving letter by letter through that orthographic mapping process.
Thank you, Diane. Are you able to see my screen, Diane?
I am, yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. All right. Okay, so what is the science of reading? The term science of reading refers to the corpus of knowledge that includes what science has determined to be relevant to reading, reading acquisition, assessment of poor reading, and the interventions available for poor readers. The science of reading involves precisely what science has discovered to be relevant not only to reading, its sub-skills and reading acquisition, but to be relevant not only, but how to modify those experiences such that poor readers can become competent readers. This knowledge includes phonology, phonics, orthography, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, neural processing as it relates to reading and its genetic basis, visual, perceptual, and memorial processing, the various writing systems, the alphabetic principle, and letter sound correspondences, among other areas, according to Herford. So there is that convergence of evidence from multiple scientific fields. And the definition, according to Dr. Louisa Mose, the science of reading is the body of work referred to as the science of reading. It's not an ideology, a philosophy, a political agenda, or a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not a program of instruction, nor a specific component of instruction. It is the emerging consensus from many related disciplines based on literally thousands of studies supported by hundreds of millions of research dollars conducted across the world in many languages. These studies have revealed a great deal about how we learn to read and what goes wrong when students don't learn, and what kind of instruction is most likely to work the best for most students. Okay, so what do we know? The 3 cueing system, it is popular in a lot of balanced literacy approaches to teaching reading. And the 3 cueing strategies typically rely on using context and text structure to help identify words. And when students are encouraged to check the picture when they come to an unknown word, or they guess which word would work within that sentence structure, those strategies take away from the word itself, and this lowers the chances that a student is going to use their letter sound knowledge and then also recognize that word in the future the next time. Instead, mapping words, orthographic mapping, explicit systematic phonics ensures that students are able to decode and map out each word by words part by part when they come across those. The system is effective for all students, while the 3 cueing system works for just some of our students. Okay, so we are going to try it. This is a passage with 20% of the words unknown or missing for us because we are fluent readers. But go ahead, I will give you a moment and go ahead and try using context to fill in the missing words and see if you can make meaning of this paragraph. Okay, that's not an easy paragraph to get through. I know I am unable to make meaning from that, even trying to put in the best guessed words into there. So let's try with a little more support at 90%. So now only 10% of those words are missing, and see if you can make sense and make meaning of this paragraph. I'll give you a moment. Okay, so again, I still couldn't quite make sense of this paragraph. It is very difficult to make meaning of it. Even if a student is reading at 90% accuracy in their fluency, there's still such a difficulty in making meaning from that text. Students need to be able to read and decode each and every word to make meaning. So here is that text with 100% of those words. And we need to aim for our students' goals to be at 100% accuracy in decoding, because it takes away from the meaning if they are unable to. Okay. Moving on. All students can achieve. Reading research indicates that 90 to 95% of all students, including those with learning disabilities, can achieve at literacy levels that are at or approaching grade level. Yes, I said grade level. The research behind the science of reading and explicit systematic instruction has shown that these students can achieve. And here are some of those studies broken down, the evidence that all students can learn. And this is how we close the gap. We need to be providing our students with the grade level content, because providing that systematic, explicit instruction, our students will be able to read at or approaching that grade level benchmark.
Another reason we really want to think about this and consider the fact that we can get to that high of a level once we understand components, pieces, and parts is that when we truly understand how children think, learn, and construct knowledge, we know that all brains learn to read the same way. You know, we know that reading is not visual, so we'll talk a little bit more when we get into the simple view of reading and that formula of why, you know, flashing flashcards or high frequency sight words are basically a futile waste of time on behalf of both the student as well as the teacher facilitating that instruction. And that 4-part processor helps us understand how the learner's brain, for all of us, over time moves in and out of those 4 individual pieces. And that if we understand those pieces and that that reading is not a visual format, but that it's orthographic mapping through that 4-part processor, then we can begin to think about what instruction needs to look like. And it's not that all children can't read, all children can read under the right supports, but reading occurs in terms of the brain for all of us in the same manner. So we just need to think about how we elevate the supports that some students might need in some areas that might be more deficit than others when we're looking at tendencies toward identifying struggling readers that could end up dyslexic, should we not intercept with the instructional strategies and the knowledge that we have that reflects that in a good tier 1 core instruction with the right tools and the right strategies, that we can certainly reach that level of 95%.
Thank you. Okay. So we are moving on to our Padlet. We are going to go into breakout rooms and you're going to have time to explore the Padlet. Now, the Padlet is full of resources around the science of reading. And then after you have about 10 minutes looking at resources, or choose one resource to focus on and spend that 10 minutes looking into that, you are going to come back into your small group of about 4 or 5 people, and you're going to discuss what you found and maybe something significant about that, and sharing with your group members for another 10 minutes or so. So it's going to be a breakout of a total of 20 minutes. The first 10 minutes, you're independently going out to the Padlet, and we'll share that link again into the chat box. And then the second half, you're going to come together in your small group within your breakout rooms and discuss the resources you looked at on the Padlet. When we come back together, we'll have a quick share out of some resources that you found. And let me first drop the Padlet into the chat again for you, just in case you need it. Okay. There's the Padlet. So you're going to want to link out to that. Does anyone have any questions they want to ask right now? If you have any issues getting into the breakout room and you're back here, I'll help you out. Or if you need to come back for any question, I can help you out. Okay. So let's get our breakout rooms. And all right, I'm going to go ahead and open those up then. Okay, we're gonna pause here. All right. So sorry if the timer in there was a little bit off, but I hope you were able to do some exploring on the Padlet and find some good resources and then have some great discussion. So do I have any volunteers who would like to share out a resource they discussed or that someone in their group spoke about? Go ahead and unmute and turn your camera on if you can and just jump in.
And it can certainly be about how some myths have been dispelled, aha moments that you've had, just discussion that you've had through the sharing of conversation and digging a little bit deep into one or more of the resources. So we're really interested in your thoughts, and we're going to wait time here.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Okay, so my coworker and I are both different, but we both are at a loss for words. And I'm reading about all the research that's been done and about how, like, the 3 cueing approach. And I'm like, this is exactly what we do every day in our classrooms. Like, we use this ERLA reading program to teach our kids how to read. And I'm like, so basically this research is telling me, like, what we're doing is all wrong. And I'm like, it's mind blowing to think, like, everything that we're doing right now is not really what we're supposed to be doing. And she and I were talking about how we learned to read, and none of this is the way that we learned to read. We learned letters, we learned letter sounds, we learned how to decode. We weren't using pictures and relying on those to read a book. We weren't told, don't worry about the words on the page, just look at the picture. You don't have to get the words correct. And I've actually said that to some of my preschoolers. Don't worry about reading the words, just look at the pictures. And so I'm thinking to myself, what am I doing? And then we're told to teach this way. We're told to use these resources because this is what the curriculum is. This is what our school has spent thousands, millions of dollars on. So I'm like, what now?
Well, it's definitely time to begin a conversation if it hasn't begun. It's like I shared at the beginning that you might be able to contextualize that a little bit more now in terms of starting a conversation about thinking about systems and structures, and how do you now find an entry point to interrupt what might be going on and have discussion about why you might need to rethink it, because many of us can look back and say we've learned something that was contradictory to a practice that we might have done in our early days. But I think the most important thing for us to think about is, as we continue to learn and grow, that when we know better, the expectation would be that we do better. And if you've ever had a chance to join, like, the Reading League conference, many of the big conferences right now, are pushing forward and have been for the last couple of years. The whole framework, the theoretical framework of the science of reading, and what we now know from research and evidence about how all children do learn to read the same way. They might need supports in different areas along the way, like we said before, because phonological awareness might be weaker, and to strengthen that so that you can move like to another level, there might have to be more supports. But the brain, all children's brains for the most, learn to read the same way. And when we begin thinking about how we really need to strengthen cracking the code and code-based skills to move toward meaning-based skills, it would not be looking at contextual kinds of things. That can be part of the conversation, but the majority of our time needs to be on giving children skill sets to actually crack the code. So thank you for those thoughts and being vulnerable, because I think you expressed what probably many people are feeling. And I'm only saying that as a reflection of what we saw in the poll in terms of this being your introduction to the science of reading, as opposed to feeling like, you're fully developed and grounded in it and just wanting to move to a higher level of expertise. So we're interested in some more thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I've been in your shoes. Sorry, go ahead.
So what would her next step be if your school district has invested in materials that may or may not be meeting children's needs and there's a lot of money at stake or not available? What would her next step be?
I think, Erin, do you want me to take it, or would you like to take it?
No, go right ahead, Diane.
I think one thing that you might do, obviously, because when we're talking about, being successful, it has to be a systems approach. So leadership obviously has to be involved, and the leadership has to be paving the way, because the leadership in the district is who changes the design in terms of structures and systems that operate and what your core program looks like. So one thing that you might do is look at the research and do an audit, a resource audit on, well, these are the resources that we use, and we might not have millions of dollars, just like a Dover City Schools that just got $2.5 million to start all over again. So you could look at what you currently have, look at what the research suggests, and there are checklists, tools checklists to look at, do these tools and resources that we are using reflect the kind of practices we would want to see, the scope and sequence that we would want to see in terms of during the early years. Are we moving from, an umbrella of phonological awareness down to, the phoneme level? And what tools are we using to do that? Are we using a Haggerty curriculum? In conjunction with the foundations, in conjunction with, looking at what you have. And then having that discussion of how do you plug holes that you found for resources that you might not have. And then it's that, it's the larger conversation of, what do we have on our plate? Are those things then that we have on our plate the right things? And maybe we need to do a little weeding of the garden. And as we think about how we do that, I think the main thing that has to happen is that you really think about elevating that message to everybody so that there's a why. It's very hard to get teachers to shift practices unless they have a good why. And when the why is so polarized to what you're currently doing, it's a hard shift, because it's like you feel like, oh my gosh, I've got to throw everything out and I've got to start all over. And we're not suggesting that, you just go in and wipe the slate clean, but you're going to have to kind of, again, work with what you have. How does it support the science of reading, and what pieces and parts do not support, and how do you work from there? But a nice way to be able to do that is through a resource / curriculum audit.
Hey, Diane,
Uh-huh.
I'm wondering if there's some tools that we don't have to give them right this second, but some resources that we also could include that would give them something that they could look at for some kind of audit like that.
Sure, we can. We'll do an email. I'm taking a note here of some other things that have been said, and we will do an email of some additional resources, or we might just say, look in the Padlet. We've added some more things.
Yeah, maybe we could add them to the Padlet. So that would be great, because that would be something tangible people could start to look at,
Sure.
and then make some decisions about where to go next. So thank you.
And so just, if you're interested, check your email and you'll know that the Padlet has been updated, and But we'll give you an email once we drop some other things into Padlet.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Is there anyone else that would like to share out any thoughts, comments? Okay, well, feel free to interrupt me if I haven't given you enough time. That is a lot to take in. So I think we're due for about a 10-minute break. Get up, stretch, get a drink, and I will set my timer here. I have 10:06, so we will be back at 10:16. See you then.
Fast in terms of during the early literacy piece, and that, you know, those foundational skills in terms of cracking the code are so extremely important. And so when we look at those pieces, there are two things there that I in that early literacy that I just wanted to go back and kind of clarify. And that is for when we're looking at automaticity in terms of automatic sight recognition, it's that orthographic mapping process where we're moving speech to print. It's not, when we're talking about automatic word recognition, it's not high frequency sight words that I had talked about earlier, that when we know that learning isn't visual, reading isn't a visual practice for children in terms of acquisition of skills. So that automaticity comes from that mapping that happens, the orthographic mapping where we put speech to print. And when we're looking at this whole word recognition side that is so extremely heavy during the early years, and we're looking at understanding the phonological awareness continuum, and I know I wanted to bring this out because I know many of you are using the Haggerty curriculum, which has kind of taken off across the country as well. And one thing that I just kind of want to remind you with that is to be smarter than the tool and the resources that you are using, because ultimately those pieces and parts are put in place and are very reflective of phonological awareness continuum in terms of the isolated skills that you're working on. But make no mistake, the thing that we want to do is move children during the early years to the phoneme level as quickly as we can. And so with those right tools and resources in place, like I said, we might be heavier during those initial years and grade levels on some pieces and parts. And we will, Erin, if you can make a note, or I'll make a note, that we need to drop that educational cascade of those skills into the Padlet. But when I'm talking about you being smarter than the materials that you're using, think about, you know, how much repetition children need, your individual children need every year, and at what point are they demonstrating mastery that you kind of think about what you might not need to spend as much time on within a scope and sequence, because you want, the intent is to move children to the phoneme level as quickly as possible. So while we start out with those phonological awareness skills, those larger skills, where we're going simple to complex and we're doing whole to part in terms of, you know, rhyming and alliteration and the blending and the segmenting, we want to really be able to move to the phoneme level as quickly as we can so that we can get strong proficiency in terms of phonemic awareness, where children can manipulate those sounds of language and as they're cracking the code. So just keep that in mind, to be a critical consumer with the pieces that you're using, and also be smarter than the program in terms of thinking about what it suggests for what children are demonstrating to you and the time that you put forth during those early years. And again, you might need to go fast to be able to go slow. As a first grade teacher, I had to do that with many things. I went very slow to be able to ground them in foundational knowledge pieces, and then we can take off and soar and go fast. So obviously you can tell my passion and my heart is in building those foundational skills, because I really like prevention models as opposed to intervention models. And as much knowledge as we can acquire in terms of how we build a strong core and what that looks like for our children in relationship to the research, the more successful we're going to be, and the earlier we can close a gap, and more importantly, prevent gaps from occurring, because conversations are much more richer, and we accomplish so much more when we are in a prevention mode, as opposed to a deficit model where we're constantly reacting as opposed to being proactive. Okay.
Thank you. And then that adolescent literacy piece, the word recognition is still, that piece still has to be there under advanced word study and fluency. The language comprehension continues with background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, verbal reasoning, and literacy knowledge. And I just want to note again, it's so important that we are all teachers of literacy. I don't know if we have any high school level teachers here or high school level leaders, but all content areas and all teachers are teachers of reading. And we need to recognize that and remember that, because we have so many struggling readers at the adolescent level as well. Okay, so we're going to take a look at this screen. The simple view of reading points out that if you can't decode the symbols in a sentence, you can't read it, even if you know the language and it's written. So here is an English sentence, but it's rewritten in a made-up sentence. The code is beneath it, and go ahead and take time to try and decode this. I will tell you, it's going to take up a lot of your cognitive load, a lot of cognitive space. We are used to reading with automaticity, but when you put text in front of students beginning to read, it is foreign to them. It takes a lot of cognitive load to figure out what those symbols mean in front of them, and to be attaching the sounds that are associated with those. So we need to make sure that we set our students up with the right structures to decode. They have to learn how to break that, and we have to provide them the key to be able to access that code. So if you take a look at that, you might be able to go down and tie a symbol to a word. We're not going to spend the whole time that it would take us to actually decode this. But again, it is in your handouts in the slides file. And I can tell you now, it is written backwards. If you do go through this and take the time to decode it, you should get KIT, RAN, and HID. But you aren't able to automatically look at that and decode that. And that's the point we want to get our students to.
And you can just see, as you're trying to go back and forth right now with the transfer, how much cognitive disk space it's taking from you. And that's why when we think about decoding, we want to move children to that phoneme level as quickly as we can, so that we can work on the decoding, because, obviously if children can't decode, then they can't read. If they can't read, they can't comprehend. And there are issues simultaneously with writing as well. So to be able to move to automaticity reduces the cognitive load that's required on behalf of, the mental capacity, so that time can be spent on comprehension and other pieces as well.
Yes. And on the other side of the simple view of reading, you must have that background in vocabulary knowledge, especially for our English language learner students. So we are going to read this. England's openers labored 34 balls before scoring their first boundary as Strauss cracked 2 fours through the leg side. Cook made a patient start before motoring past his skipper. Okay, now I was able to read that with automaticity. I was able to decode that fluently, no problem. But I don't know about you. I don't know what I just read about. I have no clue what this is about. So unless you have vocabulary and background knowledge in the game of cricket, you probably didn't understand it either. Okay. How reading works in the brain. So in 1986, two researchers proposed a model of how children learn to read called the simple view of reading. This model has been researched over decades and is still relevant today. It represents bringing together sound symbol circuits in our brains, which is simplified to the term decoding, and the word meaning circuit in our brains, which is simplified to the terms language comprehension. And it's to produce the ability to understand text, or what we call reading comprehension. So as you can see, reading comprehension requires competence in both broad skills, decoding and language comprehension. Those skills have to be connected in students' brains through deliberate and repeated interactions with language and print. So let's say if a student can decode, but doesn't have the grade level language comprehension, they will not understand what they read. If a student has the grade level language comprehension, but cannot decode, they're not going to understand what they read. This pattern is typical of students who have reading difficulties, such as dyslexia. These two skill areas are considered essential and can inform what skills we teach and how we teach them. It's important to get reading instruction right for young children. The reading research is clear that most reading failure can be prevented in kindergarten and first grade by teaching both of these skills. But we should remember these skills are what we should consider if we are working with older students who are struggling as well. If an older student is having difficulty with reading comprehension, we should investigate their language comprehension and their decoding skills. The simple view of reading serves as a framework for what we teach, what we assess, and how we determine where a student is struggling if they aren't comprehending.
And if I could just interject here for a minute, it's important for us to kind of think about also, I don't know if you're familiar with the McKenna and Stahl's cognitive model, but it's basically it's a decision rule for the most part, and it can be used at any level when you're looking at building a multi-tiered system of support, not RTI, but a multi-tiered system of support. And it's McKenna and Stahl, and I forget what the title of it is, but we'll actually drop that in. But it's a cognitive model, and what it does within the decision rules is no matter for what any grade level that you're looking at, where you may be having conversations about a student who is struggling, the first thing it does is to ask you to go back, no matter the age of the child, as can the child decode? And then if the child cannot decode, then it takes you through a whole process of the kind of assessments and the things that you can do appropriate to that grade level to determine where the design and what, what do I want to say? How you chart the journey for that child. In terms of intercepting where the deficiencies are. And then so you go down that whole pathway within the cognitive model of phonological awareness, irregardless of the age, because specific to middle school and high schoolers, when we're having conversations about them, and you're looking at root cause, teachers will typically say they can't comprehend. Well, why can't they comprehend? Well, because they might not have the vocabulary. Well, why do they not have the vocabulary? And then, we can look at that. But then the root cause always drills down to, can they decode? And then we're back to, during the early years, how we need to make sure that we provide those foundational pieces. And Erin didn't mention dyslexia, and that's a whole nother legislative piece that's surrounding us right now that we're responding to and providing information on. And there's even money out there for another grant opportunity for those of you who are aware of that. But, as we look at that, what we are attempting to do is intercept those children who might have tendencies to move toward becoming a struggling reader as a result of having tendencies that are reflective of what we know dyslexic children might represent. And these are the pieces and parts that you build in a strong core so that you keep all children together and you reduce those tendencies that might appear later through the strong core and structured reading and structured literacy. So that is another area that we really need to look at in terms of when we are thinking about this science of reading and tools and processes and frameworks. That structured literacy that is very systematic and explicit in nature and design in terms of scope and sequence will give us the most bang for our buck, and that's what the dyslexic legislation in Ohio is suggesting / mandating that we begin looking at. So as you're looking at structured literacy and what that represents in terms of explicit instruction, that's very systematic. We take these pieces and parts and intertwine them into that information and begin through an audit and some other means of looking at the current practices that we have and how might they support the research and what we need to do to build that strong core so that we're spending more time differentiating within tier 1 in a strong core before we even look at tier 2. And that's something that's extremely important, that as we build that strong core, that we think about what does differentiation within a multi-tiered system of support look like in tier 1 before we begin having those conversations of in addition to tier 1 within a tier 2 and a tier 3 system.
Okay. All right, so we're going to start looking at the brain. So how does the brain learn to read? We've talked about how everyone learns to read the same, and we learn to read from speech to print. Our brains are wired to speak from birth, but not to read. Children automatically learn to speak by just being around language. No matter what language it is, babies are able to pick up language patterns and learn to speak. Again, our brains are not wired to read. It must be taught. And you are going to hear this again in this presentation. So let's look at the brain. People who become experienced readers use and integrate several regions of the brain, primarily in the left hemisphere, including the parietal temporal region, which is towards the back. And that does the job of breaking written words into sounds, which is word analysis or sounding out words right around this area. The occipital temporal region, which is also at the back down here, is where the brain stores the appearance and the meaning of words, letter word recognition, automaticity, language comprehension. It's critical for automatic and fluent reading so that a reader can quickly identify words without having to sound out. So the frontal region up in the frontal lobe allows a person to speak. So those three areas interact and make connections from the front to the back of the left side brain and around when reading. We are actually going to watch a video, about 9 or 10 minutes or so of this video. And this is going to help us better understand how that works in the brain.
What was the most interesting?
Sorry, we're going to back up.
Well, we're going to move on to a new section called The Science of Reading, How the Brain Learns to Read. And I'm really excited to bring this content to you. I think it's really fascinating. So we talked about how our brains are wired to learn to speak. And there are regions of our brain for speaking, both for pronunciation and for sound and accessing meaning. And what's very fascinating is that if you surround children with spoken language, they automatically learn to speak. Unless they have a learning disability, they will pick up language just by being surrounded by it. And they will learn to speak and learn the sounds of whatever language is being spoken to them around the world. It's also really fascinating. They've shown that babies under a year old can discriminate all the sounds in all the language of the world. Adults cannot do this. So under the age of 1, they can tell the difference between sounds that you can't tell the difference between. So that Russian E and E, they can hear the difference. But as they listen to the language or languages spoken to them, they narrow that group of sounds, and then they can no longer tell the difference between sounds that aren't in that language that are similar, that are close together. Does that make sense? It's really, really fascinating. One researcher says that baby brains are constantly taking statistics on sounds. And it's kind of like what we were talking about. The brain is really good at learning patterns. And so as the babies listen to language, they kind of figure out the patterns of that language, and then their brains become sensitized to those sounds. And there's a region of the brain that is activated with the sounds of the language. The pronunciation and the articulation of those sounds is in one region of the brain. And then as they grow, those sounds become connected to meaning. And the meaning of those words are stored in other places in the brain. And so then the sounds ball becomes connected to the meaning ball. So it's just fascinating how the brain is wired to listen to sounds and then connect those sounds to meaning. So the question then becomes is the brain wired to learn to read, right? Because just by being surrounded by a language, student or children will learn to speak. But if children are surrounded by books, will they learn to read? And the answer is no. They will not. Our brains are not wired for reading. Children learn to read by being taught. And it's super interesting in the brain science. So this is how the brain of a strong reader functions. And we're going to come back and break this down. But what I want you to understand is that strong readers read with the back left region of their brain. And the other thing I want you to notice is that there's an overlap here with the access to the meaning and the pronunciation that those babies have generated or young children have learned. Does that make sense? So something's connecting. You see that to already the same regions used for spoken language. But what else is interesting is when they do functional MRIs on people who are reading, who are strong readers and struggling readers, strong readers use this back left side, and reading connects into the spoken language system of the brain, and struggling readers use the front right side of their brain. They use completely different sides of their brain. So what is going on? Because in addition to this, researchers have found that IQ has very little bearing on reading ability. In fact, recently they've found that children who have difficulty learning to read often have above average IQs. So what is happening? How does the brain learn to read? This is the really big question. A lot of this presentation is taken from the book and the research of reading the brain by Dr. Stanislas Dehaene. There are many other books, many other research articles, many other neuroscience presentations, all pointing to the same thing. However, I've been really influenced by this book, so I wanted to share that with you. It's very fascinating to read it. Reading starts as a visual input. This is the brain of a strong reader in this back left side. And then it moves to the region called the letterbox. Now, the letterbox is also called the visual word formation area. And this area is really important. And we're going to come back and explore it a little bit more. But for now, what I want you to see is this visual input goes to this area called the letterbox, which the brain recognizes letters here. And from that region of the brain, those letters then access the sounds. They can see these pathways forming, that it goes from letters to sounds, and then it goes from sounds to meaning. They can literally see this happening as they do the neuroscience research. So reading starts as this visual input, goes to the letter box, they recognize that it's a letter, they then use that information to access the sounds, then they can use their auditory lexicons. So they already have, oh, the sounds ball mean ball. They can use that information to then access the meaning of that word. And again, neuroscience is very clear. This is what's happening. So what's also really interesting about this, and that's become very clear, is once an emerging reader knows the sound to letter correspondences, and by the way, this research is happening in many, many, many languages around the world. So we could replace the word phonogram sound correspondences just fine here. It's just what is the picture and what is the sound. They now know that an emerging reader can self-teach fluency just by reading. And that's very clear in the research. Now, there's something else that's very interesting about the neuroscience is with practice, the brain can develop an additional route. And that additional route looks like this. You'll see it goes from vision, letterbox to sound to meaning, but with practice, they can go straight from the letterbox to meaning. Now, something super important to understand about this. They are not doing one or the other. They are doing both in parallel. The brain is amazing. So they are accessing sounds and meaning in parallel simultaneously. Does that make sense? It's really fascinating. And it's also very, very clear. You cannot develop this second route without first establishing this route and practicing it. Again, they know this. So what does this mean? Something that we know as well is that beginning readers read serially. They read one phonogram at a time. I had soup for lunch. You've heard this. And so they hear those sounds and then they use the sounds to connect that to the meaning area of the brain. But as they progress, reading serially goes away and they begin to process in parallel. So when you see this sentence, I had soup for lunch, you feel like you've understood it as fast as you've read it. You feel like that even when you hear it, right?
Oh, sorry.
I had soup for lunch, you just get it. Well, it's through all that practice and the formation of these two pathways processing in parallel that we can read so fast. Just to emphasize, advanced readers read in parallel. They're processing all of the sounds and the meaning. So the letters and the sound correspondences and the meaning all at once. They are not reading whole words. Rather, there is just an illusion that they're reading whole words. But again, the neuroscience is clear. When they look at what the brain is doing, it's an illusion that it's whole words because we do it so fast.
Okay. So we are going to jump back to our presentation. And the one thing I want you to remember is that advanced readers read in parallel. They process every letter and the meaning all at once. It becomes automatic. They are not reading the whole words. Reading whole words is an illusion because it happens so fast. So when students learn to read words as a whole word memorized rather than letter sounds, they're using the front right side of that brain and not activating the left where they get the access to meaning with the visual inputs in that visual word formation. You will have access to that video through the PowerPoint, and I do encourage you to watch the entire video. It is truly fascinating, the science around how the brain learns to read, because learning to read actually changes how the brain codes phonemes or sounds. The brain forms connections of fiber channels between letters and sounds, and it's an anatomical change that happens when we learn to read, and it's actually been observed on MRI scans. So for example, and if you watch the video, you will hear her, the presenter, talk about this and state how a person who can read the words rain and plane in text, even though they recognize that they are spelled different, when they're asked if they rhyme, the letter box in the brain is actually activated and lights up in an MRI to search and find out, do those words rhyme, even though they are spelled completely different.
So this all begs the question of us needing to think about what side of the brain are we activating through the facilitation of the instructional strategies that we're using? Are we causing the brain to work harder and activate the side that doesn't work as fluently? Are we rerouting children to have to work harder in their cognitive desk space because our instructional approaches are activating the side of the brain that's not as efficient? So what we need to do in terms of thinking about, so what does this mean to me with respect to why, is thinking about the research and contextualizing it to what professional development do we need, or do we need to have, and then indeed implement within our core to make sure that we are activating the side of the brain that's most efficient and not causing children to reroute synapses, which creates the struggle, because we create deficits in children in terms of how proficient and efficient they become by the instructional strategies that we select to facilitate and implement.
Yes, and so we want our reading instruction to be systematic from phoneme to grapheme correspondences, so those sounds to the text, because that makes those fastest changes in the brain and routes around from the sounds to the meaning and the letters and builds that fluency. So that's where we get orthographic mapping. It is the mental processes we use to turn an unfamiliar written word into an instantly accessible and familiar sight word. It requires letter sound proficiency, phoneme proficiency, the ability to establish a relationship between sounds and letters unconsciously while reading. And this will develop naturally in about 60% of students through exposure through literacy activities. Okay, so remember that phoneme proficiency is the smallest sound. It is auditory. And that grapheme is the written text. So all students, as Diane said earlier, should be receiving that core instruction at the tier 1 at grade level. So you want to instruct students mapping out words by each sound, not each letter, but each sound. So if you give a student the word charge, how many sounds are in charge? Ch, R, J. So for the ch sounds, let me move this so I can see. We represent that with CH. Ch, that is one phoneme. R is represented by AR, and J is represented by GE. Put it all together, charge. Our next word is slight. How many sounds are in slight? S, L, I, T, 4. S is represented with S. L is spelled or represented with L. And in this case, I is spelled IGH. It is one phoneme, it is one sound, and T is represented or spelled with the T. Put it all together, slight. Okay, our next word is phone. How many sounds are in phone? F, O, N. We are going to represent or spell the first sound in phone, PH. O is spelled with an O, and N is spelled NE. And here's where you can make those connections. The E is on the end because the O says the long O. And we have phone. All right. You also will have irregular words that maybe traditionally you're teaching students to memorize the whole word as sight words. Well, those can be mapped as well. So given the word what, how would you map that out with it being spelled irregular? You would still break out the sounds. How many sounds in what? W, t, 3. There are 3 sounds. The first sound is represented with w, w-h. Now, the second sound, we are going to spell and represent with an A. And the last sound t is with T. Now, these can be your heart words where you would have to remember that in the word what, is spelled with an A. So we can still, again, teach our students sight words, but in a better way so that they're not memorizing whole words, but they're memorizing the sounds and parts in the words. Okay, so a quick test of where we at. I will launch a poll. If children get stuck in their development of phonics skills, go ahead and take your best guess, A, B, C, or D. They are not likely to make much progress until any underlying phonological awareness deficits are addressed. B, they should be encouraged to shift to a whole word approach. Let me get my polls here. C, they should continue with the same regimen of phonics instruction until they finally get it. Or D, they should be encouraged to rely on contextual guessing. Again, these are anonymous. Okay, I'll give you another moment. We have about 80%. Just get a few more in there. Ten seconds for the last few. Okay, I will go ahead and end the poll and share the results. Okay, you guys are getting it. So the answer is they are not likely to make much progress until any underlying phonological awareness deficits are addressed. Remember, we don't want to shift to the whole word approach. We want to continue to go in, assess the students where they are and find out what those deficits are and provide the interventions where they are at for the students. Most of us did get that. So awesome. You are with us and paying attention. I am going to go ahead and end that.
The other thing that you might want to think about in relationship to deconstructing all of that is that no matter how, no matter how high the effect size might be on a phonics program that you have, if you're lacking a strong phonological awareness program, that provides the foundation, children aren't going to make that transfer as readily as they into that phonics program. And the phonics program is never going to be as successful as it's designed to be unless there is that connection that transitions from what they've learned through a strong phonological awareness component into that next level of phonics.
Yes, so let's dig into a little bit deeper what that decoding looks like at the word level reading. So decoding skills include the understanding of print concepts, which is the organization and basic features of print. So for young learners, young students, preschool, they're recognizing environmental print. So the big M, the golden arches, they can look at that and read that and know it's McDonald's. For our older students, children already reading, they're able to recognize paragraphs, chapters, and the order of text. In phonological awareness, that is demonstrating awareness of the speech sound system, such as word symbols, onset rhyme, first sounds, and phonemes. And included under the umbrella of phonological awareness, it's the big umbrella, and we want to work down into phonemic awareness. It's the awareness of those individual phonemes, or the smallest unit of sound in each unit of speech. Phonics and word recognition. It applies phonics and word analysis skills or the patterns of spelling. Word knowledge includes building that sight vocabulary and allowing instant and effortless retrieval of words in both regularly and irregularly spelled words. So the mastering of all of these components will lead to fluency, which is the sufficient accuracy, rate, and expression to support comprehension. Okay. On the other side of language comprehension, that includes academic language skills, which is both background knowledge and academic vocabulary. Academic language skills are formal communication structure and include words that are common in both books and school. Background knowledge means learners process general and topic-specific background knowledge, as well as the ability to relate a series of events. So in other words, inferential language skills. Academic vocabulary means the ability to comprehend and use words in discourse and in formal writing. And once learners have these, they'll have the ability to discuss topics beyond the immediate context. Okay, so we are going to look at a foursquare of where students may be with the simple view of reading. In this upper left-hand corner, you have student 1 who has typical or high-level skills in word recognition, but not the skills necessary for language comprehension. So they are not going to master reading comprehension. And this would be an example of a hyperlexic student. Over to the right top box, we have a student who is proficient in word recognition and language comprehension. That is your typical or advanced reader. And that is our goal. We want our students to be skilled in both word recognition and language comprehension. And then down at the bottom here, this is where it indicates the weakness in phonology. So low word recognition, low language comprehension skills is our general struggling reader. They're low in both areas. On the bottom right side, low in word recognition skills, but high in language comprehension skills. That is an example of a student with dyslexia typically. So we have to address those underlying phonological awareness deficits, and the instruction needs to target the student weaknesses. So it's important to assess more than just reading comprehension. When we decide on an intervention, we need to dig in deeper and see where those weaknesses lie. Okay, so word reading is dependent on phonological awareness. Those early phonological awareness skills are rhyme, alliteration, syllables, first sound awareness, and then moving into letters and sounds. So rhyming, cat, hat, clapping syllables, cat, apple, apple. Beginning sounds of words, the first sound in cat is k. Moving down that continuum, those basic phonemic awareness skills, phoneme blending and segmenting. So if we have the word cat, we're breaking out each phoneme in there with k, a, t, and blending it back together, cat. Down to those advanced phonemic awareness skills. So that's your phoneme manipulation, substitution, deletion, and addition. And that leads to automatic word decoding. So some of those skills. So if I'm continuing with the word cat, we have the word cat. We said the first sound was k. Go ahead and replace that k with the h sound. What's the new word? Hat. All right. Or That would be an example of substitution. You could do deletion. So the word is cat. That first sound is k. You're going to get rid of k. What do we have left? The word is at. So we need to provide our instruction based on our students' needs of where they are at once again. Until we properly understand how to promote permanent word storage, we're going to continue to have many weak readers, as David Kilpatrick said. So let's take a look at the ladder of reading. So in our classrooms, this ladder of reading was put out by Nancy Young, and it says that in the top 5% of your classroom, those students are going to learn to read effortlessly. So they probably come in already knowing how to read, right? The next light green level, 35% of our students are going to learn to read relatively easy with broad instructions. So however you're teaching reading, these students are going to pick it up. So you've got about 40% of students in your class that are going to learn to read if you're providing instruction. Now we're getting down into that peach tier where 40 to 50%, learning to read proficiently requires more. They need code-based, explicit, systematic, and sequential instruction. Down at the bottom where we see our students with dyslexia, 10 to 15% of students, they require that code-based, explicit, systematic, and sequential, as well as diagnostic instruction with many repetitions. Let me show you what those numbers might look like. So let's say you have a class of 25 students. That top percent that comes in already knowing how to read, maybe one student. Add in those students who are learning to read with that broad instruction. You've got 8 more, about 9 students are readers and they are on grade level, they are on track. Now we're moving into, they need that structured literacy approach to be able to learn how to read. From the peach down is going to be our struggling readers unless we provide that structured approach. We're looking at 10 to 12 students who need that in the core to be able to become proficient. Just like that other 9 students, even more need the core than had it. Okay, down in with our dyslexic students who need those interventions, about 2 to 3 more students are going to need that. So you have 60%, a larger percentage of students are not going to learn to read without that structured literacy instruction provided by you. So this shows you just how important this is. Okay, again, orthographic mapping is how sight words are stored. It requires advanced phonemic awareness, letter sound knowledge, and phonological long-term memory. When these 3 interact with one another in such a way as to produce long-term orthographic memory of all the words we learn, there is nothing intuitive about orthographic mapping, as David Kilpatrick said. Okay. So, given everything we've discussed, I think we have time for about, maybe I'll cut it down. We were going to do about 10 minutes in the breakout rooms. We'll probably do around 8. I want to give you time to talk, but I just want you to discuss within your small group. I will do the same groups. What maybe you can do to make your instruction more prescriptive. And then when we come back together, if anyone would like to share out for the good of the whole group, we will have time for that as well. So again, about 8 minutes or so. Let me get breakout rooms. We'll do the same ones. Let me get the time right for you this time. We'll do 8 minutes. Does anyone have any questions? So how can you use the simple view of reading to make your instruction more prescriptive? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and open the rooms. Here we go. Susan, I'm sorry. Did you want me to put you in a room?
Sure.
Okay. I have you out here, not
I would
assigned.
love to hear.
Yeah. Let's go into room 4.
Format to take the word recognition side in the first book, as well as the language comprehension side in the second manual. Voyager Sopris does offer face-to-face opportunities that coincide with the license and the modules that that you would go through. And that might not be an option for your district. I know, in Dover, because they received as much money as they did, and we built their local literacy plan around the science of reading and Ohio's plan to raise literacy achievement. All of those teachers, title teachers, many middle school and high school teachers are participating in capacity building through those modules. But if that's not something that your district is interested in doing or can do, I did want to share with you that this is really nice timing, because I hopped on the Ohio Association for the Education, the Ohio Association of Elementary School Administrators had a reading summit yesterday, and Brian Collier, he was so inspirational. He's a read aloud illustrator. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. But Dover was presenting at that, so I hopped on because I wanted to support their efforts and their presentation. And I continued to the end because Dr. Carol Tolman was doing the closing keynote, and she's one of the co-authors with Louisa Motes for the Letters program. So I listened to that information again, because it's always good to hear it more than once. And but then I learned that Ohio has a site, and we're going to, and I hadn't even talked to Erin about this yet, and we will drop it in the Padlet, where you can actually go on and preview some modules that are aligned to the same type of format that the letters modules are aligned to. It's an Ohioized kind of opportunity, and it's free. So if that is something that you would want to peruse on your own, you can work your way through. There are certificates, and it's just another means for you to, on your own, in your own time, be able to peruse through yet another site and continue building your capacity in your time. And it might be something that you would want to do with a group of teachers. There are all kinds of endless opportunities, but we will put that information in the Padlet and get it out to you, along with some other requests that we've had today. One more thing that you can be looking for is that there was a discussion in one of the breakout rooms where we talked about rethinking how you might organize your own personal read aloud library, in terms of, like, one thing that I do now when I'm intentionally looking at books and selecting them, I'm thinking, oh, I could use this for phonological awareness. So I have a whole crate / many tubs of books that are specific to alliteration, or specific to rhyming, or that I could use for rhyming production or rhyme completion, or just identifying rhyming, and other books that I could use for blending and segmenting. But to begin thinking about reclassifying your books, these are good books for good go-tos, and intentional books that you would select for phonological awareness or language development or print concepts. And I did share that I have some, they're not the most recent book lists, where those categories are reflective of books from, I don't know, it's probably 5 years ancient, but you could certainly add what you currently have and use it as a start to begin asking your local library to pull books for those foundational read aloud books, to support playing with the sounds of language, or just build your own personal library. So those are some things that you can be looking for in the Padlet. And we hope you've enjoyed your time with us today and that we've challenged your belief systems and encourage you to think how you might start a conversation that might be worthy of helping more students than what you currently are in different ways, so that we can increase the levels of proficiency in the area of reading in our state. And I just have to say that it's an exciting time to be in Ohio right now, and that Ohio is really being recognized and moved to the forefront for some of the initiatives that we're taking on, some of the frameworks that we've adopted, the means in which we're attempting to build capacity and implement those. And specifically for Erin and I, we continue to have access to just the most awesome experts in the field that we can build our capacity. But, you know, I've often said I haven't been in the classroom for many, many years, and it doesn't matter how much I continue to build my knowledge unless we can find a way to get it to the teachers that are out there in the field with the grassroots efforts where the rubber meets the road. It doesn't matter how many professional development opportunities I get to sit in on, unless we can find a way to branch out and bring that information to you and assist you with your leadership, with rethinking where you might go and what you might need to do to weed the garden and build capacity. It's not used as heavily and will not reap as many benefits as it should. So the only other thing that I want to encourage you to think about when we were talking about the curriculum audit is if you haven't gone through the reading tiered fidelity inventory, that is something that Erin and I facilitate at districts. It's another place to start, to begin to look at strengths and weaknesses within your program, and provide a roadmap for what your next steps might be. So those are some more things for you to think about. And if that is something you're interested in having us facilitate at your district, it's in Ohio, we like to have trained facilitators facilitate that reading tiered fidelity inventory, and the literacy specialists within each state support team are the ones right now who are trained to do that. So reach out to us and let us know if there's anything else that we can support you with in your efforts, and we will get back with you. And in the meantime, until we hear from you again, or have you join us with some opportunities that we provide, stay in the trenches, keep doing good work. Remember, when you know better, you do better. And children are certainly worth our time and our efforts. So unless Erin has anything else to say, oh, there's a question here. Will there be any other science of reading trainings offered by the SST? We will probably repeat this, and if there's some interest, Leanne, we'll probably look into being able to do that in the spring again, based upon the feedback that we get today. So if that's something that you would like more of, let us know in that assessment and that feedback and the evaluation. We do have an emergent literacy series that was developed by our Ohio Literacy Leagues that we will be offering in the spring. And so I'm not sure, I can't tell you for sure that we will do that, but we would certainly try. I know right now there's a lot of interest in technical assistance with the dyslexia grant application. And so if any of you are involved with that, a lot of what you learned today are pieces and parts that are going to be looked for within the rubric of the scoring of that dyslexia grant, specific to science of reading, structured literacy, those pieces and parts. So we have some things on the table that we need to address within deadlines. And if we can insert, if there's interest and we can insert some other science of reading offerings, we will certainly do that. So with that, we are going to say goodbye, have a nice lunch, and carry on, everyone.
And don't forget, you can always access our website for on-demand videos that we did have in the spring.
Yes, they were excellent. And oh, the other thing that I am going to try to design, since we had such a heavy offering of the experts in the spring, is that I'm really going to look into building some professional development around structured literacy, and look and hope to begin a discussion with Nancy Young and be able to bring her to the area virtually, if not in person. So that's kind of where we are with our Hope Twos and what we're working on right now.
Thank you so much. Yes.